In chapter 1, we looked at what is development and what is underdevelopment. And to follow this chapter, very well, it's good to actually have a good understanding of chapter 1, to understand actually what, Rodney means by speaking about development, which he talks about being in an economic sense, that not all development is economic, but we focus on the economic aspect. Not to say that every development is economic. Um, and developments, as we have seen in terms of in Europe, had some various stages from communalism to slavery and feudalism. But that's, as we will see in this chapter, Africa did not follow the same pattern. But development implies a development in increasing the productive capacity of a society, which over time changes the social relations, and the social relations can push forward development, and then after some time can also be a hindrance to further development. Um, and a characteristic of development has been that has been uneven across different societies, you know, but that some societies can rise for some time and then later have a slower development and so on. And we saw with the case of Egypt, being more advanced than other societies and likewise. So we are going to see that trend as well of uneven development here when we discuss in this chapter. So those are things to bear in mind. But like I said, it's good to have a grasp of the first chapter, which we can't go through in much detail now. I advise people to try and check out the discussion of the chapter on our YouTube page. So today we'll be looking at only section 1 of chapter 2, which will be a general overview of how Africa developed before the coming of the Europeans up to the 15th century. In section 2 of this chapter, Rodney goes through concrete examples of African kingdoms and societies to show examples of what he was talking about in terms of how Africa developed. But we will not be looking at section 2 today. We'll be looking at it next time. So in chapter 1, established that Africa is underdeveloped due to exploitation. So basically, Africa was developed, and in terms of the relation with the imperialists, European was overexploited, and that is the condition. It's not even a condition of underdevelopment, but rather of overexploitation, which explains the current status of underdevelopment that we see in Africa. If we look at Africa before the arrival of the Europeans, we see uneven development. For example, we have the Ethiopian Empire in that period versus pygmies who live more simple lifestyles in the Congo, or even within the Ethiopian Empire itself, empires of the Western Sudan. That's the empires of West Africa. So we're not going to look at Africa as uniformly developed, obviously. Development was uneven, but one thing that was certain is that there was development across the board. So and we're going to speak today about African development. We're going to try and avoid using the word civilization. Basically, because if you look at so-called European civilization, it is actually characterized by much barbarism. So it is better to speak of African cultures rather than African civilizations. And the culture is a total way of life. So it's not just about the economic aspect, for example, of a culture, or if you like, technological aspect. You have to look at many aspects that constitute the totality. And within Africa, we can look at similarities as well as differences to talk about, and for example, an African culture or African cultures, which constitute what we look at as signifying the development in Africa. Um, Africa south of the Sahara has some similarities culturally. For example, Rodney says Africa is the continent of drums and percussion. We are saying that African art is among the best that the world has seen. Um, when we even talk of culture in terms of musical culture, dance, is one thing that has been clear that African culture could not be eclipsed or superseded by the European culture. And in fact, cultures are not comparable. It's not something that you say one culture is better than another. Um, so, but certainly, African culture way advanced in terms of art um, at the global level. Something about, in terms of the African cultures as well, is that there has been a religious worldview. And in fact, African dance and art has been linked with a religious world outlook. Um, so, if for those of us who followed chapter one, remember that religion is an aspect of the superstructure. That is, we have a like an economic base, and within which follows some social ideologies, ideas, political formations, and so on. And religion is one aspect of that. Um, and religion can play um, both a positive and negative role. Uh, in a positive sense, religion can mobilize people for joint tasks. In terms of when we are talking about development, religion has been positive. It mobilizes people for joint tasks such as forming states and being a vehicle for social justice. But religion can be quite negative when it persists unchanged for long periods and conflicts with the need for technological change. And note, we are not saying that that negative is what we are saying was the case for Africa as a whole, saying that Africa was certainly in an evolution and was changing and was developing. And certainly there are some places where the religious aspect has played a negative role, and some places where it has played a positive role. And in fact, religion as superstructure is not unique to Africa, but was the case in all pre-capitalist societies, and in fact, within capitalism itself. In terms of in Europe, religion played a very negative role in terms of its economic development, in putting its economic development back for a long period. Um, so um, we have, in looking at the stage in which Africa was at, you know, up to the 15th century in general, we had the predominant principle of social relations was that of family and kinship associated with communalism. Um, and we should note that similar social institutions found everywhere. Um, sorry, communalism is one phase through which all human society has passed. It's not something that is, uh, some might say, as if it is specific to Africa. Every society around the world has passed through the phase, but in the case of Africa, communalism was very predominant up to the 15th century. Um, and of course, with that, alongside family and kinship ties, which were the basis for um, for the way people organized, their societies, and the way they worked and the way they produced and so on.
Yeah.
I'm just going to try, and someone is not muted, so I'm just going to stop for a moment. Um, okay. So, and either matrilineal ties or patrilineal ties determine each person's position. And I think we should note this. You know, it's commonly thought that everything descends on the patriarchal line, on the line of the male. And in fact, if we were to go and do an in-depth study of development across the world and not just in Africa, we find that originally it is matrilineal. You know, descent comes from the down from the female line, and people, um, you know, tie their kinship and their down their ancestral line down the female line. That is quite traditional. So over time it changes, of course. So we had in Africa now either matrilineal ties through the female line or patrilineal ties determine each person's position. Um, Basically, land was owned by groups, either the family or the clan, which is based on an ancestor from which everyone in the group is descended from. Work on the land, not just on the land, but also hunting and fishing was organized by the group. Food and goods were distributed on the basis of kinship ties, and there was basically equal distribution. Um, there were some, you say, level of stratification through age. Um, with age, you had greater rights in a sense, in terms of political rights, and it was also a factor in determining obligations. Age grades and age sets reflected the idea of seniority through age. And so through the family line, we have, for example, um, say a young man wants to marry into the family, of another family, and he will be obligated to provide labor, to the father of his bride, and that was a way of you know of age and um, the family ties determining what people's obligations to give work, and also to, in terms of how to share the joint wealth that is produced by the groups. Um, so the individual at every stage of life had a series of duties and obligations to others in the society, as well as a set of rights. So now, of course, when we talked about chapter one, we looked at how Europe had stages after communalism. Um, in Europe, after communalism broke down, slavery was the new form for mobilizing labor. And when we look at Asia, Asia was different. It did not have a situation where slavery was the dominant mode of production, although slavery was certainly widespread. And we had in Asia from basically communalism to feudalism, but Asia didn't advance to capitalism unlike Europe. In terms of Africa and say progress beyond communalism, um, Africa never had an epoch of slavery, although there was practice of slavery to some extent. Most slavery actually found in Africa was found in North African and other Muslim societies, where feudalism was the structure of society and slaves remained in that status for generations. But when you look elsewhere, you find African communal societies, that is, societies that were not feudal, had slaves being foreigners captured in war, but they were able to become ordinary members of society after some time. There was no scope for continual exploitation in a society that was not feudal or capitalist. So the stages of development we have seen in Europe were not seen in Asia in the same way, and certainly not in Africa. To quote Rodney, most African societies before 1500 were in a transitional stage between the practice of agriculture, including fishing and herding in family communities, and the practice of the same activities within states and societies comparable to feudalism. So African societies were really, most of them were in a transitional stage before the Europeans came, at the time the Europeans came. Um, in Africa, societies that became fully feudal were extremely few. Most societies were in a transitional stage in which communal elements coexisted with feudal elements. And these feudal elements actually had African peculiarities. So it's not similar at all to um, these feudal elements were not similar to European elements. Probably we'll discuss that a little bit further down. Um, we had a variety of social formations. Pastoralists, which we call herders now, cultivators, fishing societies, trading societies, uh, nomads. Uh, there were no hostile class relations as such. Yes, indeed, we had age grades and difference in status between religious leaders and others, but no exploitative or antagonistic relations. Um, so, where class conflict was a key driver of development in Europe, we had, in this absence of class conflict, nonetheless, development to increase production in Africa. Age grades and other communal labor helped to mobilize for work across isolated family units. For example, the Dokwe work group of Dahomey in the picture, if you can see the picture clearly, for example, it's a work, group of people come together to do work on building houses and agriculture and so on, basically. Um, so those were crucial in helping to boost production for those societies. Um, and of course, Africa developed with the um, development of new techniques, you know, because development implies, increasing capacity to deal with the environment, to win a living from nature. And of course, in Africa, um, um, we had, same thing, basically. So development of tools and skills to deal with the environment. So while the way labor was organized, like we said in the previous slide, in terms of work groups and so on, and family units, all these help to produce more. The major change in the production forces concerned the development of new techniques. And by the 15th century, Africans had a considerable understanding of the environment, of the total ecology, soils, climates, animals, plants, etc. Agriculture was the dominant activity, and techniques were applied to improve it, such as terracing, crop rotation, green manuring, mixed farming, and iron tools usage. We had the domestication of cereals, such as millets and rice, the cultivation of yams, pottery making, all of this related to the discovery of iron. I should say briefly, I should have said at the beginning that Movement for African Emancipation, we have a such series of on African history, and we'll be bringing out more on it, and a key thing that, Europeans try to undermine the use of iron in Africa, or the capability of Africans to discover iron smelting, make iron independently. It was discovery at Knock which is now in Nigeria, that was proven without a doubt that the independent discovery of iron smelting was made. Whereas previously Europeans had tried to claim that any iron that Africans used was based on copy from Europe or elsewhere. So it's key to understand that Africans independently discovered the possibility of using iron. And of course, not every society, but societies shared these techniques amongst themselves, you know. And so that and iron obviously was crucial to the development of agriculture, um, to produce more. So then going further on the agriculture, we have shifting cultivation, burning and light hoeing, something the Europeans thought was actually backward. Yet it was based on a correct evaluation of the soil potential of Africa. Europeans didn't understand that over farming upset the thin topsoil. Of course, the preceding is not to suggest that African agriculture in the early period was superior to that of other continents. Um, for example, animal husbandry was not as advanced in Africa as it was in Asia and Europe. Um, Whereas in Europe, the landowners and capitalists had incentives to increase production. Under communalism, there was sufficient land for everyone, and so few social pressures for technical changes to increase productivity. Asia also had a communal system of land ownership, but the state directed improvements, such as in irrigated farming. And there are possible reasons for Africa not having supervised state direction of agriculture as was seen in Europe. One of those is the lack of population pressure due to the fact you had a lot of scattered settlements. Second thing is that um, when states traded, a lot of it was not largely in agricultural products, but in other things. So there was no incentive really to push massive increases in production. So yes, you could say that in some areas, African agriculture was not as advanced as in other places. Um, in terms of manufacturing, achievements have been understated, obviously, by the Europeans. Um, and because there's this tendency to see manufacture as something that has to be made by a machine, but manufacture simply means made by hand, actually. So you had in Africa products made by hand of very high quality, which is comparable or superior to what you find elsewhere. And some examples that Rodney gave: Moroccan leather, which were tanned and dyed by Hausa and Mandinka specialists in modern day Nigeria and in Mali. Um, we had Congo textiles, which were made from bark and palm fiber. We had cotton cloth from the Guinea coast, local copper from Katanga and Zambia, iron from Sierra Leone. In terms of the copper and the iron, when the Europeans came to these places, it was clear, in fact, that this was superior to what you find elsewhere. Um, in fact, the locals, those around the area and preferred that product to products coming from elsewhere. Um, the thing about African manufacture, though, is that it was yet to make a breakthrough at the level of scale. Um, but changes were already being made. There was greater specialization and division of labor. Now, again, if you when we discussed chapter one, we looked at how specialization is key to increasing development and increasing productivity. We looked at the case of early China, how it changed from small family units to starting to have a surplus of production, where that now required administration, and you started to create, you started to have people who were specialized in certain tasks, And they started, because these people are specialized and that's all they spend their time doing, they get a higher status in society and so on. But with the specialization, the fact that people had surplus, they were not just making only enough to feed themselves, but there was always a surplus that allowed, the growth of specialization and division of labor, which also pushed more and greater production. And so we were seeing that already in Africa. In the cloth industry, there was separation of dyeing from cloth making, separation of spinning from weaving. We saw a guild system developing. The guild system is something that in the European transition to industrial production was an intermediary stage, a very important stage, apart from the use of machinery for moving to capitalism, to industrial production of capitalism. So we're already seeing the guild system developing in Benin, in Benin Kingdom. We had brass and bronze guilds in Nukbe. We also had glass and beads guilds. And basically, the guild is a group of specialists come together, as an association, um, and to increase the skills and techniques, and to pass on the skills and techniques over time, and so on. So that was going on. Of course, another way of looking at development is trade, and Africa was a continent of innumerable trade routes. Um, Trade is an excellent indicator of economic expansion and other forms of development. Um, and of course, traditional African economies were often subsistence economies, but at the same time, the majority of African communities traded to fulfill their needs. Mostly it was trade between neighboring or not too far distant societies. Trade was a function of production. The surplus of what was produced could be exchanged to get what communities lacked. Often it was barter, trade by barter, but that also started to give way to money exchange. So you use, whether it is salt, cloth, iron, cowrie shells, gold, copper, as mediums of exchange. Um, so again, following from trade, we have other changes of a social political nature that accompany the expansion of the productive forces, which we had all over Africa, and that is the development of states. Um, Initially, the development of states proceed, with greater stratification in society. As castes develop, um, you start to have a ruling elite in a sense. Skilled workers in fields such as iron, cloth, pottery, leather, salt making form close groups and become privileged. Ruling groups arise as some individuals' families become more successful than others, and royalty develops. Now, one thing I want to just say is that when you look at development, it often is accompanied by greater exploitation and greater, um, greater stratification, which of course in itself is a negative because you start to have unequal distribution, but it is just part of development. As you have greater skilled workers who can help to increase the production, you also start to have people that become treated with greater um, respect or whatever, and over get paid more than others, and then of course, and as you create states to defend your interest as well, you know um, you start to form, like, because they become important for your security and wherever else, it becomes a case that they now start to become privileged and they start to take more and more from the society. And um, that itself now will give way to other possibilities over time, which we saw in Europe. But, like, for example, if you look at capitalism in Europe, is the fact that capitalism came about was not itself a negative, but the fact that capitalism came about and overstayed in a sense, it started to become a fetter. It started to put society backwards. But the fact it came in itself in the beginning was progressive. So we have to look at that. That is what we have seen as well in Africa, in the sense of where we have seen development, not whole scale. As we will discuss, there are places without states, or those centralized state structures that were developed by all measures. But you will have um, you will have greater stratification. That is normal. Um, so so though communalism remained fairly predominant across Africa at that time, there was a transition to monarchies in many parts. We saw clashes between different social formations in parts of Africa that led to the winning group dominating and becoming the ruling group. Example, Mandinga and Hausa were the overlords of the Fulani cattlemen, what we refer to as herders now, right up to the 18th and 19th century. Whereas in the East Africa, we had the cattle people being, dominant over the cultivators. So, interestingly enough, because people don't tend to look at history, we are looking at current clashes between the Fulani herders and farmers right now in Nigeria, but not understanding it from a historical sense at all. That this is something that has been going on for centuries. Um, so um, I should also say there were often peaceful relations between the different social formations. They had a symbiosis where they exchanged goods and coexisted to mutual advantage. But there were instances of clashes, so it's not like the clashes were a regular thing. I should emphasize that if I give the wrong impression. Um, so the period of transition from communalism to feudalism in Africa was one of state formation. So it was through states that we began to see the coming to be of feudalism. States went hand in hand with the development of ruling groups and lineages, which pushed unequal distribution and demanded labor or taxes. But in some areas, there was no central state, whereas there was development. For example, the Igbo in Nigeria or the Kikuyi in Kenya both had sophisticated systems of political rule. They developed agriculture and iron working, but there was no centralized state, just as I was saying earlier. Um, but in most cases, or in many cases, suddenly we had development of states alongside, the beginning of feudalism. And I should state that the feudalism we see in Africa again is with African peculiarities. It went hand in hand with communalism. You didn't have a system very much like you had in Europe, where the serf was basically a slave tied to the land. You certainly had the development of monarchies, but monarchies that were by and large checked to a great degree, not absolute monarchies. Um, and whereas which were involved in taking more and more from the general population, but it was not really at the extreme stage we have seen either in Asia or Europe. Um, so overall, the development of the state was a spur for greater production and specialization. When in reality, the state is an instrument to be used by a particular class to control the rest of society in its own interests. Um, so basically, you have, a class of maybe landowners who use the state as an instrument to keep people in line for what. what they are expecting or obligations that they expect them to fulfill, like the summation of tribute or taxes or whatever. But it's also an indice of the fact that that society has become a society that is producing much more and has reached a stage of specialization. It's quite well economically developed. Um, so the next time we do this, I'll play a video where there's a discussion by an anthropologist about what stage Africa was developmentally, before the Europeans came. And you find that Africa was basically at the level of development of Europe in many respects. Um, so this idea that Africa was at a lesser level, all things considered, certainly respect of European propaganda. And when we look at next time that we look at this chapter, we will see some examples as well of some concrete states and societies to see the level of development there. So, in conclusion, there were developed states in Africa and stateless and classless societies as well. The larger states represented an evolution away from communalism, sometimes to feudalism. Uneven development characterized African development just the same as it did everywhere else. So that's it. That's, like I said, we'll be continuing the chapter the next time. Thank you for listening, and the floor is open for discussion.